Welcome to the Kevin Bass Show long-form podcast. If you have an idea that you take from this podcast that you want to apply to your own life, you should always talk to your doctor before doing so and never construe anything you hear as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the Kevin Bass Show. Hi, this is Kevin Bass. I'm going to be talking about continuous glucose monitoring for non-diabetics. Continuous glucose monitors are simply a device that you place onto your triceps, or upon your abdomen with a small needle that goes beneath the skin into the interstitium and samples the blood glucose within that compartment in your body. It's a very similar value to blood glucose, but not entirely identical. And it's being bandied about by quacks, by charlatans, etc. on social media, and many false claims are being made about it. In this video, I'm going to simply perform or reread or talk about frequently asked questions that I wrote last year on this topic as I was getting deep into the literature, because this pseudoscience is making a resurgence. In fact, there is a woman on Instagram called Glucose Goddess. She had like 100,000 followers as of last year. Now she has almost 1 million. The rise of this discourse has been astronomical, and it's been terrible because there's no evidence to support pretty much anything that a lot of the people are saying about continuous glucose monitoring for non-diabetics. And in this podcast, we're going to talk about that in a question and answer format. So the first question is, don't traditional clinical tests miss glucose variability that can only be detected by CGM? And by the way, before I do all of these questions, I want to point out that, in fact, the first 3 or 4 questions are going to be they're not going to be super exciting, but they're going to be built upon to create a more interesting and sophisticated perspective in the last few questions. And so they're a necessary evil. We have to go through the basics first. But we're going to go through those basics. So to repeat the question, don't traditional clinical tests miss the glucose variability that can only be detected by CGM? This is true. The answer, this is true. However, we do not know whether or how the glucose variability detected by CGM predicts outcomes. This has never been studied. We only know that this variability is not detected by other tests. But we don't know what to do with that information. If we were to guess what to do with that information, we might in fact get things wrong because we're guessing. And CGM could end up being less predictive of disease than traditional clinical measures of glucose metabolism. This could actually make CGM worse than useless. It can make it harmful. Question number 2. Doesn't high blood glucose predict heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, etc.? So this is a reason for non-diabetics to use continuous glucose monitoring, right? Answer: yes, high blood glucose as measured by traditional clinical tests, such as fasting blood glucose levels and HbA1c, predicts the development of many diseases. These tests have been validated as important predictors of these diseases. CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, has not. There have been no studies showing that CGM predicts the development of these diseases. Any kind of CGM readings whatsoever. Any kind of blood glucose readings whatsoever on CGM. There's no data showing that any of these readings predict the development of these major chronic diseases. Because CGM data has not been validated for this purpose, we do not know exactly how we should use CGM data to do what these other tests have been shown to do. What are the appropriate cutoffs for disease risk prediction for CGM? What are the cutoffs to use? What level of blood glucose? How long? And will they necessarily correspond to the equivalent cutoffs using HbA1c? Or OGTT? Or fasting blood glucose? We have no idea. We do not know at all the answer to that question. And we have no real way of guessing it either. There's a couple methods, but those methods are essentially the same as just using OGTT in the first place. So why not just use OGTT? We don't know how to take the additional information that CGM gives us that OGTT or HbA1c doesn't and add that to our risk prediction models. We have no idea. There's absolutely no data to show any of that. No idea. Okay? All right. Next question, question 3. But doesn't high blood glucose variability predict heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, etc.? And again, we're going to go on to the same, basically the same idea. Yes, high blood glucose variability, as measured by traditional clinical tests such as oral glucose tolerance test, OGTT, predicts the development of these diseases. So both high glucose and glucose variability both predict development of these diseases, okay? OGTT has been validated as an important predictor of these diseases. Definitely, for sure. And OGTT, by the way, just entails drinking a load of glucose, 100 grams, I believe, in most cases, and measuring blood glucose 2 hours later, okay? But CGM data has not been used for that purpose, and there's no data on it. There's no prospective data that predicts disease. We have no idea what cutoffs to use. Now, because CGM has not been validated for this purpose, we don't know exactly how we should use CGM to do what these other tests are doing. For example, OGTT measures glucose levels 2 hours after a standardized glucose load. Above 140 milligrams per deciliter indicates prediabetes. Yet many people will interpret any glucose spike among 140 milligrams per deciliter at any time as harmful. Yet a blood glucose level 140 milligrams per deciliter 2 hours after a glucose load means something entirely different from a blood glucose level of 140 milligrams per deciliter immediately after a glucose load. We do not know the relevance to disease of a blood glucose level of 140 milligrams per deciliter immediately after a glucose load, as you would see on a CGM, because that's never been studied. In fact, many people, in fact, maybe even most people, have a blood glucose of above 140 milligrams per deciliter, at least for a very temporary and short period of time after taking an oral glucose tolerance test, if you measure it by CGM. But we don't know what that means. Maybe even everybody. We don't know what it means. It may be totally harmless, well, or it may indicate serious pathology. We don't know. No idea. Question 4. Okay, but although we don't know exactly what the cutoffs should be for blood glucose spikes, doesn't simply reducing blood glucose provide a benefit? Answer. We do not have any reason, or good reason at all. We don't have any good reason for believing that this is the case. There are 2 reasons why we don't have a good reason. First, we do not know why blood glucose spikes, as recorded by OGTT, predict outcomes. They do predict outcomes, but we don't know why they predict outcomes. What do I mean by that? Well, is it because of the blood glucose spikes itself that we're getting increases in Alzheimer's disease, increase in cancer, increases in cardiovascular disease? Is it the blood glucose itself that's causing these diseases? Or is it the underlying pathology that causes the blood glucose to remain high 2 hours after a glucose load? So you have underlying pathology, you have high blood glucose, but this underlying pathology may itself cause all sorts of problems, or it may cause other things to happen that in turn cause all sorts of problems. This elevated blood glucose is only one aspect of the pathology. It's only one biomarker. It only indicates one thing. And we don't know if the many other things that correlate with high blood glucose, because they're all caused by the same underlying pathology that causes the high blood glucose, we don't know if these other things might be the cause of these diseases. Maybe it's just the high blood glucose predicts these diseases, but blood glucose itself is not the cause of the disease increase. And that's extremely possible. In fact, likely we have a similar thing that happened with what's called C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein correlates very tightly with cardiovascular disease, but we know that CRP itself doesn't cause cardiovascular disease. Why? Whatever causes the CRP, which is interleukin-1 beta, that causes cardiovascular disease. So simply lowering CRP by itself, no effect. But lowering IL-1 beta, big effect. CRP strongly predicts cardiovascular disease, but it's not the cause. And something very similar could be the case with blood glucose as measured by OGTT. So just because we measure blood glucose by OGTT and see an elevation in risk as a result of blood glucose rises from OGTT, dysregulated blood glucose, doesn't mean the blood glucose itself is causing the effect. So it doesn't entail, therefore it doesn't entail that we should be trying to control blood glucose spikes no matter what, because blood glucose spikes may not indicate the underlying pathology that's actually causing the disease. Or it might. We have no idea what it means. We don't know. It just predicts disease. That's all we know. Okay? We know a little bit more on some animal studies, and there's some very interesting data. But it's not conclusive. We don't know. Okay. The second reason that simply reducing blood glucose may not provide a benefit is that we don't have any good reason for believing that simply reducing blood glucose spikes is helpful. Because after meal triglycerides increase when you replace carbohydrates with fat. And when you replace carbohydrates with fat, you lower your blood glucose. But then you increase your triglycerides temporarily. What about the increase in triglycerides? What if the increase in triglycerides is a result of lowering blood glucose because you're replacing carbohydrates with fat? What if this increase in triglycerides is actually causing more disease than the blood glucose would? Or what if simply replacing carbohydrates with fat and causing a higher triglycerides and lower blood glucose doesn't change anything, because it's neither the triglycerides nor the glucose that are causing the disease, but the underlying process which is causing something else to happen, which is causing the disease? We don't know. And it could be the case that replacing carbohydrates with fat and increasing triglycerides actually causes worse disease. We don't know. But there's this assumption because we can measure blood glucose, because we can see it, therefore it's important to tinker with. Therefore it's important to lower. It's the most important thing. But we can't measure triglycerides, and so we assume, therefore, that it's not an important thing. But this is an assumption based on simply the historical accident that we can measure glucose and we can't measure triglycerides, and therefore we ignore triglycerides and we pay attention to glucose when we shouldn't be ignoring triglycerides and paying attention to glucose. We should be paying attention to other things too. But we become obsessed with the one thing we can measure, which may not actually have any impact. And reducing it may actually cause more harm by increasing other things we cannot measure. Incredible! Think about this, people. Think about what we're doing. This is science. Don't go on to Glucose Goddess's Instagram. It's an Instagram account. It's an Instagram. She doesn't know what she's talking about. What's more is after meal triglycerides like glucose, doing a oral fat tolerance test. There's such thing as an oral fat tolerance test, not an oral glucose tolerance test, an oral fat tolerance test. Doing after meal triglycerides, guess what? You do an oral fat tolerance test. 2 hours later, you look at your triglycerides. What do levels of triglycerides predict from an oral fat tolerance test? They predict cardiovascular disease just like oral glucose tolerance test predicts. Is it the fat? Is it the triglycerides that are causing cardiovascular disease? Or is it some other underlying process? Because it's certainly not glucose in this case. It's something else. Is the same underlying process that's causing elevated glucose and elevated triglycerides itself causing cardiovascular disease? Or is it some combination? Freak, we don't have any idea. We have no idea. Do we therefore want to reduce glucose by increasing triglycerides? It is not clear that this is beneficial, and it may be harmful. Yes, indeed, using continuous glucose monitoring, and then trying to use that to reduce blood glucose by increasing fat and reducing carbohydrate may cause more heart disease and cancer and Alzheimer's. We don't know. No data. Okay? Zero. Except that both triglycerides and glucose elevate this risk if you have high levels in response to a test. That's all we know. What is the interpretation of that? No idea. Question. Wait, I thought that CGM simply helped people to eat in a healthier way. Lowering carbohydrates is not necessary, right? Answer. In a trial comparing ultra-processed to an unprocessed diet, there was no difference in either the average blood glucose or glucose variability between the diets, despite a 25% higher carbohydrate intake. This shows that degree of processing, whether you're eating processed foods or not, does not affect CGM, and neither do significant differences in carbohydrate intake. In fact, in another trial comparing a very low fat to a ketogenic diet, only then do we see any substantial difference in blood glucose and glucose variability, and these differences are still modest, about 10% difference with an ultra high carbohydrate diet versus an ultra high fat, low carbohydrate diet. It's almost zero carbs versus almost zero fat. And we see like a 10% difference in blood glucose. Remarkable. Those differences are not going to be seen mostly in the real world. It's going to be much less than 10% difference. In many cases, it's going to be almost nothing because the body tightly regulates blood glucose levels. So you have to do extreme things in order to get big changes. And big changes is like a 10% change. That's all you're getting. In other words, on average, only large reductions in glycemic load improve, quote unquote, improve readings on CGM, not healthier eating. Healthier eating doesn't help CGM at all. Therefore, the only real dietary interventions that can be expected to meaningfully lower glucose excursions or CGM are substantially lower carbohydrate diet, weight loss, and additional physical activity. Ironically, since we already know this from clinical trials, we don't need CGM to implement these changes. So everything that we already know can be discovered through CGM, but we already know it in the first place, so we don't need CGM to discover it. We already know it. Lose your weight. Do a substantially lower carbohydrate diet. Add additional physical activity. That's it. We already know all that though. CGM doesn't help. It costs money. That's all it does. Question, but don't responses to each particular food differ from person to person? Answer, this is true. This is true. And perhaps some CGM can provide some insight into this difference between different people. As above, however, there is no good evidence that knowing these differences will provide any meaningful health benefit. It is not even clear that such knowledge will meaningfully impact average blood glucose or glucose variability. None of this has ever been shown in any study, and such hypotheses are notoriously commonly fail in randomized controlled trials. Oh, conceivably by doing this, then maybe. Often these conceivable hypotheses, most of the time, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, they fail in randomized controlled trials. We have every reason for believing that it's not going to pan out. Okay, but question, doesn't reducing glucose spikes reduce hunger? Oh, this is a favorite of Glucose Goddess and her followers. Answer, in a recent study by Sarah Barry and others I think at King's College London, if I'm not mistaken, after meal glucose dips correlated with hunger with an R of 0.16. An R of 0.16 is almost random noise. If you look at what it actually looks like in a graph, it looks like random noise, like no correlation. You can only use statistics in a computer to find a correlation that the eye could not see. That's how noisy these data are. So there's barely any correlation whatsoever between after meal glucose dips and hunger. While statistically significant, though, it is clear that after meal hunger is overwhelmingly related to factors other than blood glucose, not blood glucose, but other factors in the diet. Healthfulness of diet, fiber content, amount of volume of the diet, protein content, calorie content, palatability, etc. Hacking the blood glucose to reduce after meal hunger, in other words, is like doing physical exercise to become a better chess player. It's like running a marathon because, running a marathon is going to make you a better chess player, you think. Physical exercise may help to maintain overall physical and mental health and have some positive effect on chess performance. But the main determinant of chess performance would be practicing chess and just being a talented chess player. Using CGM for hunger is like running marathons to be a great chess player. It's nonsense. It's not related, or it's very just loosely related. You'd probably just be fine just being relatively physically fit. You don't need to run a marathon. CGM is the marathons of CGM is the marathon of metabolic health. No additional marginal benefit from running a marathon, just simply being a very fit person. And certainly compared to simply monitoring how you eat, looking at factors that are associated with overeating, not eating junk food, not eating things that are hyperpalatable, not eating things that are ultra processed, etc., etc., etc. CGM, using a CGM hat, having this thing on your shoulder, this is my CGM, bro, and like the 2 CGMs on each shoulder to compare them. Look, it's majoring in the minors. It's a lot of effort, a lot of time, but not much payoff, according to the science. Now, next question. But I feel CGM benefits me personally. Are you saying I can't use CGM? Answer, nobody is saying you can't use CGM if you feel it benefits you personally. Nobody's gonna outlaw it, okay? I'm not outlawing it on my website. I'm not outlawing it in this YouTube video. This video is not a declaration of outlawing CGM. You cannot use the CGM. Get angry at me in the comments because I'm telling you you can't use it. It's illegal now, according to King Kevin of YouTube, of the nation of YouTube. Bro, I'm not outlawing anything. I don't have the authority, so just don't get upset. I'm not outlawing it for you. Keep using your CGM. Go. Be free. Use your CGM. If you feel it benefits you personally, go for it. Just know that there's no evidence of benefit, and that perception of benefit can be distorted or inaccurate or due to non-specific effects of intervention or placebo, as is often the case for personal health anecdotes. And if you don't know this, check out the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect. And this is one of the reasons why Peter Attia likes CGM. Because of the Hawthorne effect, which is an interesting argument. An interesting argument indeed. And in fact, Peter invited me, based on a lot of the content I've written, to be on his podcast and debate CGM with him sometime. And I may do that. Maybe this year. Hopefully this year. I've just been so busy. But I may do that. And we'll talk about the Hawthorne effect there. But you can look it up. Question. What harm could there be from using CGM as a non-diabetic? What harm could there be? Why are you making this video being so mean to me? And I just want to use my CGM and you're being so mean. Answer. There are several potential harms of using CGM as a non-diabetic. 1, wasted time and money. 2, prioritizing lower glycemia over higher value lifestyle changes. I'm going to explain all this in just a moment. 3, prioritizing lower glycemia over a healthier diet. 4, increasing cardiovascular disease risk via after-meal triglycerides or some other mechanism specific to the new diet. And 5, risk of compulsive disordered eating behavior induced by the use of CGM. Now, let's talk about the first one. The first is obvious, wasted time and money. If there's no benefit, one risks time and money that one will never get back, ever. 2, opportunity costs. How much time could you spend exercising or sleeping or with friends that you spent analyzing glucose data? Hi, sorry, bros, I can't go out. I can't go out tonight, or I can't go out today, or I can't hang out with you. I have to analyze my CGM. I can't go work on my business idea. I have to analyze CGM. Wasted time and money, opportunity costs you could be spending doing other things. 3rd is the classic replacing blueberries with bacon. Replacing blueberries with bacon will provide better glycemic control. You might get less glucose spikes. Is that a good idea? No! That's a garbage idea. But in order to know not to do that, you got to know that blueberries are healthier than bacon. However, if one believes that controlling blood glucose is paramount to health, which there's no evidence of that, as I've shown, one might indeed replace blueberries with bacon. Thus, the healthfulness of CGM may depend more on pre-existing health nutrition knowledge and less on whether or not one reduces blood glucose. Without this knowledge, CGM can end up pointing dieters in harmful directions, sacrificing health to achieve lower glucose readings, similar to how nutritional illiteracy with low-carb diets can undermine the healthfulness of low-carb diets, for example, by reducing weight but increasing LDL cholesterol and increasing heart disease risk. The fourth point, increasing cardiovascular disease risk via after-meal triglyceride increase or other mechanisms specific to the new diet. It's already been discussed, but to recap, after-meal triglycerides like glucose are associated with worse health outcomes. And after-meal triglycerides rise on a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet where you're replacing your carbohydrate with fat in order to reduce your glycemic readings. But maybe those triglycerides and that extra fat is actually going to be more harmful than the glucose itself, or as I pointed out earlier, maybe none of those things have anything to do with the health outcomes, and it's the underlying pathology and the other things that it causes that are not related to glucose or triglycerides that are causing the increase in heart disease risk, dementia, Alzheimer's, cancer, etc. But there's a potential here for actually increasing harm by focusing so much on the glucose and not on other metrics. And finally, the fifth reason. Every dietary intervention risks developing compulsive disordered eating behavior. It always exists, this risk, when you do a diet intervention. If CGM for non-diabetics is not beneficial, then many people will be exposed to risk and some harmed for no benefit at all. And that's just disordered eating behavior. That's not heart disease and all these other things we've been talking about. And with that, I hope you loved the video. If you liked it, please leave a good positive comment. Send me a message, positive comment. I really deeply appreciate this. I need your compliments. I need the positive things that you're saying. I need you guys to say that I'm amazing, because 95 to 90% of the comments I get are me saying I'm human garbage. Okay? And discouraging me and wanting me not to make any more videos. And that's because I'm critical of so many different things. I don't like health fads. I debunk them. And I debunk the hardest health fads to debunk. I'm the guy who goes after the difficult stuff, the most popular stuff, the stuff that's supported by scientists, etc., that might be garbage and that they're just using in order to make money, even though they're scientists and they know better. Happens all the time. The stuff where I put my neck out. And so I get a lot of blowback for that. And if I get some positive stuff, that'd be great. I love to hear positive things from you because it makes me feel encouraged to continue, because I hear so many negative things constantly. Hope you guys can help me out with that. Please do. Apart from that, I want you guys to please subscribe to my Patreon. That's another thing you can do. If you can subscribe to my Patreon, send me $5 a month. That would help my life out a lot. And then you add on top of that, send me nice comments. That's what you can do for this channel if you love this content. Now, if you have negative comments or you're angry and all this stuff, don't comment. I'm not going to respond. I'm going to block you. If you have critical things, you want to add information, you want to cite a study and give me more information that you think I have missed, love it. Love it. You're my friend. But if you do it in an aggressive way, I'm blocking you. All right, with that, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Peace. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please check me out on patreon.com at Kevin and Bass, where you can donate and make this podcast possible. Also check me out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where you can find my latest thoughts on the latest controversies and findings within health science. Also check me out at The Kevin Bass Show, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I hope this podcast was useful to you. If it was, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. See you guys in the next episode.